think most of you know Lis Costa. She's the managing director of the Behavioural Insights team in the UK offices. I think, and she's also I think you're still a visiting professor, aren't you, Lis, at the Department of Behavioural and Psychological Sciences, at the LSE. So she's got strong links with the LSE as well. There's a few, I see Renee's here as well, but there's a few people that have got very strong links across the policy sector and the academic sector, which is, obviously a very, very, very important space, I think. And Lis is one of the primary operators, I think, in that space. I think today she's going to talk about various issues to do with sort of behavioural regulation, if we can define it in that way. Lis, am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So the usual format is that Lis will speak for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll hand over the rest of the time for the discussion, and we'll finish it on the hour sharply. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Lis.
Great, thank you, Adam, and thank you for inviting me to do this as well. It's really nice to be speaking with you all, and I hope we can have a actually quite an interactive session. I don't have any slides. What I was planning to do was put forward some ideas and thoughts, particularly around regulation and behavioural markets, and then open it up for discussion, because I think this is an area that's I guess emerging, and also quite a rich area to debate as well, what the approach of behavioural scientists should be, but also the approach of regulators and policymakers as well. In terms of my involvement in this, so as Adam said, I'm the managing director of BIT in the UK. So I manage our London office and our Manchester office, about 150 people. And I've been with the team for, just over 8 years now. And when I joined the team, one of my first roles was really to set up a practice around consumer markets, financial markets, and really regulated markets generally. And some of the first papers that I wrote and experiments I ran were looking at things like how to encourage consumers to switch energy provider, how to get people to engage with their pensions, and then moving sort of over those 8 years from those quite simple interventions to more complex ones. So I thought I'd provide some reflections on where I think that field is at and where it might go as well. So I think the starting point for this is that I think there are many market failures generally that are behavioural in nature, or at least are better explained by using behavioural science as well as traditional economic models, and particularly in markets where we see a lot of inertia, choice overload, and friction playing a disproportionate role in people's decisions. And I think what we've seen really spearheaded in the UK, but around the world, is that market regulators have now a much more sophisticated understanding of behavioural science and have been able to integrate that into their economic models, and to really build teams that are able to diagnose behavioural challenges in markets or behavioural market failures, design remedies to address those, and also to experiment, both with online experiments and field experiments as well, to see if those remedies and interventions are effective. And I think that's been really impressive to see. And it is a movement that is, around the world. I was speaking at the OECD on Friday, and many of those countries around the table, at least in their financial regulators and their, competition regulators, they have a behavioural team. And really, I think that work has led to better outcomes for consumers, but also better outcomes for competition as well. And I've just seen Rupert join. He'll be able to add a lot to this as well. But I think to date, a lot of that great work by regulators has focused on designing and testing remedies that are focused on the individual consumer. So particularly looking at things like improving disclosures, encouraging people to switch providers or to consider different options in the market. So different savings accounts, different credit card options, things like that. And that has been a really effective approach. So a lot of those interventions have been very low cost and been able to be integrated into existing processes and systems. So to give an example, it's, we're now going on probably 5 years ago that we ran this experiment, but back when energy prices were in a different place in the UK, we ran an experiment with Ofgem to look at how to encourage people to switch energy provider. At that point in time, there was a competitive market, there was a lot of choice, and there was real differentiation in price across the market. So it was possible for people to save, upwards of £300 a year by switching energy provider. But people weren't doing that, even though the process was actually relatively simple and straightforward. And the intervention we designed was a letter that was personalised. So it would come to the household, say, Elizabeth, you could switch, you could save up to £350 by switching. Here's the top 3 deals in the market for you, and here's how you can switch. And what we found was that letter tripled switching rates. We had 2 different interventions. So one was that letter being sent by the energy company. The other was the letter being sent by Ofgem, the UK energy regulator. The energy regulator letter doubled switching, and the energy company letter tripled it. I think probably because of just the recognition and trust in that brand. But what those kind of headline results mask is that this coming off a very low baseline, and actually it was increasing switching from 1% to 3%. So cost effective, worth doing, but not something that is shifting the overall market dynamics. And I think that is the case for a lot of the interventions that fall into that category of focusing on discrete individual behaviours. They are cost effective, they are effective, but they're not on their own shifting market dynamics. And so I think while that's to be celebrated and continued, I think there is opportunity to do more on 3 fronts. And I'm going to go through those quickly, and then I'm keen for us to have a discussion about them. I think the first is using regulation to create an enabling environment, and particularly to shape people's economic choice environment, but also increasingly their digital choice environment, so that the behaviours that you're trying to encourage are easier, cheaper, more socially acceptable, and more timely. And we can go through some examples of what that might look like. Thinking about this from a sustainability perspective, it would be things like green number plates, which make the availability and the changing social norm around electric vehicles much more socially normative and visible, and give people the opportunity to signal their pro-environmental credentials. But I think lots of examples where we can do more in that enabling environment. We've also just run a series of experiments on where we simulated online food delivery platforms and looked at how we can encourage people to choose options on those platforms that contain fewer calories. So again, I think there's just a lot to be done around shaping those environments, making those choices much easier, more socially normative. Secondly, I think there's more to be done upstream, so shaping systems and markets in line with collective policy goals, and really focusing on the incentives and regulation for businesses and organisations, so that those businesses are able to create the best possible choice environment for individuals. So again, kind of sticking with the sustainability examples and the energy examples, again, we just ran a study where we found that 9 out of 10 people want to be making more sustainable choices, but the same proportion of people find that really difficult because they find it difficult to discern actually what is the greenest choice in all kinds of markets. Like, what is the greenest pension fund? You know, what's the most sustainable food choice? What's the most sustainable transport choice? These things are very confusing and complex. And I think there is a real role for regulation and for businesses to, I guess, demystify that and help consumers put their purchasing power behind those options that are in line with what they want to achieve, but also in line with broader policy goals. Really also enabling us to reward suppliers who are providing the best quality products and services in a market. Then I think cutting across those two areas where I think we can do more as a field, there's a question in my mind about whether, I started this by saying that I think many market failures have behavioural elements to them, but I also wonder whether there are some markets where they are, the failures in those markets are very distinct. So particularly things like online gambling and social media, where the addiction, the types of failures that you're seeing in the market are so behavioural in nature that I wonder whether we should be thinking about those markets and regulating them in a different way. This is something that my colleague Andreas from the Danish Competition Authority also put forward at the OECD on Friday. And I think it's a very good challenge of, you know, should we be thinking about those markets differently? I think what's definitely the case is that we know very little about how people make decisions online. And how they make decisions in online environments. And it is incumbent on all of us, I think, to be building that evidence base and to be thinking about how we really kind of rebalance between regulatory agencies and policymakers and big tech companies who are experimenting on a minute-by-minute basis and actually have a very sophisticated understanding of how we make decisions online that far outstrips actually what we know in the academic world, what we know in the policy world about that, even though it's so consequential for our societies, for our democracies, for our economies. And yeah, I think a big challenge for us over the next decade, and opportunity as well. So I might stop there and open up for discussion, and happy to provide more examples. And yeah, I was really trying to use those areas to provoke discussion more than anything, because I think there's lots of meaty questions in there about how we go on.
Okay, so we can have some questions and comments now. You know, just ask your questions and comments in the normal way by putting your virtual hand up, and then I can see who's first and etc. Rene's going to kick us off.
Sure, why not? Thank you, Liz. Thanks for sharing these thoughts. Very interesting. So I guess I don't have a concrete question other than to say, what do you think that can be done about it? Because of course, if we're thinking about, say, online platforms, we're in a constant struggle. I say we from the point of view of the regulator. I work for the European Commission. So obviously our interest is public well-being and fairness, and not making sure we protect the consumer. And the online platform, as far as I can see, their only objective is to increase profit and market share and world dominance. They had ethics teams, most of them, until very recently, and development is, whatever, membered or eliminated. So it's quite clear that the gloves are off. It's very clear that they just want to make money and will just do the minimum that they need to do in terms of regulation. Now regulation is catching up. So the way I see, one thing we can do is obviously the whole transparency issue, opening up all these algorithms. You will have seen that the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency was launched on Tuesday here in our civil. So this is an attempt to open that black box to see exactly what is happening. So once you do that, I guess one thing we could do is establish some sort of dialogue or some sort of guidelines to say, okay, these are the biases that we know you can easily target. We'll just take the first 10. And these are the ones that we know that you're using. So if we catch you using these, you're going to be fined. So this will be, and as far as I know, that conversation hasn't taken place yet. A little bit, a little bit in the Consumer Rights Directive, we talk about defaults, but it's not really elaborated.
Yeah.
So that's it. And the other thing is maybe, as you suggest, maybe have a watermark of saying, okay, well, it's not regulation, it's more soft. This is an ethical website that respects the consumer and can be trusted. And if you don't have that one, then you miss out on consumers. So these are my thoughts. Basically, what do you think are the options, the tools available to counter the force of the platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of thoughts, and I think others on the call are well qualified to come in as well. So I think that the piece on kite marks and reputation regulation is really interesting, and I think underutilized at the moment. The examples where platforms have really drastically changed their behavior, I think, are related to moments when their reputation has been called into question, and that's had real consequences for their ability to hire the best people, their ability to work productively with governments around the world. So I do think there's more to be done there. I think there's some foundational pieces around quantifying the different types of harm. And you started by saying, that the focus is on consumer welfare, but we actually have very little empirical data about the different types of harms that are driven by different platforms. And there's the piece of work that Hunt Alcott did a few years ago now, I think early 2019, late 2018, that was quantifying the welfare effects of Facebook, where are people familiar with this paper? Okay, so he recruited a sample and he paid one arm of the sample to deactivate Facebook for 4 weeks. And then he measured a whole host of different welfare indicators for the group that stayed on Facebook and the group that deactivated it. And he found that their subjective well-being was higher where they were deactivating the platform. Lots of other interesting things like people's exposure and belief in disinformation and fake news also reduced, but as did their knowledge of any type of news. They were more likely to spend time outside, spend time with friends, and also more likely to not go back onto the platform after the 4 weeks. So it was a really interesting experiment looking at, I guess, that complex picture of the welfare effects of being on the platform. But as far as I'm aware, that hasn't really been done for different types of technology and different platforms. Like, what is that picture for WhatsApp, for Instagram? And I think these are really important questions when you're thinking about how to regulate them and what the consumer welfare puzzle looks like, really. Equally, more work to understand the mechanisms of some of this. So there was also a paper published a few weeks ago now that looked at the way that different Facebook algorithms were trained and the types of behavior that they trained on. And gosh, am I going to be able to explain this well? So it was basically looking at algorithms that trained on very quick decisions, like what to look at in a news feed, tended to be more biased. than decisions that were based on something more deliberative. So like a sort of a second order preference, if you like who to add as a friend on the platform. So really interesting looking at what types of behavior are these algorithms training on, and how likely is that behavior to be a quick, automatic, relatively biased decision versus something that's more deliberative, more in your slow brain, if you like. And then I think overall, what can we all be doing? Well, I think we can be experimenting more. So again, I think there's been some really interesting experiments on things like how to reduce misinformation on online platforms, but they've tended to focus on a point in time. So there was a nice piece done by Irrational Labs with TikTok, for example, that looked at how flagging and down rating misinformation on the platform reduced the number of likes, reduced the number of shares, and generally reduced engagement. But obviously TikTok is a highly adaptive system. And so it's interesting to see that in a point in time. But the more interesting question is, how do the content creators adapt to that? And how do other people on the platform adapt to that? What's the stickiness of that intervention? And I think for all of these platforms and online decisions, we need to be designing evaluations that are taking those second order and long run effects into account, so that we can get a much better picture of actually, if you were trying to shape this system overall rather than at a point in time, what would that need to look like?
Okay, thanks, Liz. Yeah, I think you're next.
Hi, thanks a lot. So I have two quick questions. So one is with regards to energy providers. I'm still somewhat puzzled that this is not this is still a market where an individual needs to choose and change. I mean, the private companies that offer you for a service fee to switch your provider for you and do those choices based on, I want it green, I want it cheap, and then they do this for you. Why don't you create the whole market in a way like this, that is the default, I opt in, right? That's the way you do it. That's an option for me, and all providers have to comply with that feature, so that can be done. And the second question is regards to this problem that people don't know what's green, for instance. I work in this area and I'm still puzzled here in Denmark. I see public social marketing campaigns about not drinking and driving, but we know what behaviors cause carbon footprints or high intent, just like eating red meat, for instance, compared to alternatives. But I don't see any social marketing campaigns telling me, you want to stop climate change? Here are the 5 things. And we know those things, but we're not communicating them from top down. I was just wondering if you have an idea why we're not doing this.
Yeah, great question. Let me start with that one, which is that I think those things are known, but they're not widely understood. And actually, there's a really nice study done in the UK by Ipsos Mori in the lead up to COP26 that showed the massive disparity between what people thought were the most emission reducing activities and what actually were. And so many people thought that small, discrete, available things like not using your dryer, for example, were the most, or turning the lights off, were the most impactful things they could do, and completely bypassing things like reducing red meat consumption. So I don't think that those things are widely understood. And we did some work in the lead up to COP26 on how you could boost awareness of that. But I think ultimately awareness boosting, it's not the answer. I think it is about creating environments where actually these choices are the norm and the default, and they are easy and socially normative. So things like making plant-based food the default in canteens, rather than encouraging people to choose it amongst a menu that only has one vegetarian option. So that's on the second point. On the first one, yes, I think it would be amazing to have a world where automatic switching was the norm, and it's something we push very heavily here in the UK. But ultimately, there weren't that many services who are able to do it. And oh, that's great. Thank you, Lisa. I thought that was a great report. Yeah, there ultimately weren't that many people who were doing it well, and they were also facing the same engagement issues of getting people to sign up for those services and to trust them. So I think in order for that to become the norm, it would need to be a regulatory intervention, and I don't think the regulators were willing to go that far.
Okay, sorry, just unmute myself. Thank you. Rupert.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks, Liz. I was just, I think there are two things I wanted to get at. Like, one is kind of some rays of optimism, I think, like in response to Renee's despair about the incentives on like social media platforms. There are some pockets where actually some firms are quite savvy actually about protecting users and like understanding the behavior, like actually things like dating websites in particular, right? So some dating websites are like the Wild West, and you know, deliberately so. That's their pitch, is like, hey, just do what you want to do, and we'll facilitate, but we don't care. But someone like actually want to like take that kind of safeguarding really seriously, right? So they will have some nice design features, like if someone's like messaged you like 8 times and you haven't responded, they obviously can notice that and they'll be like, hey, look, it looks like this is this person like harassing you, like, so they care about the welfare. They've got different incentives to some of the other firms to like care about the welfare of the users, and they've got quite a lot of data and nice like timely mechanisms to say, hey, do you want us to step in, or like, can we adjust your settings or whatever, like. And so I think there are some areas where you think actually there's some good stuff there that you can actually help people shape their behavior and what's happening, but make possibly what they're doing themselves as well. I don't know what they do to the guy who sent the stupidest guy who sent the 8 consecutive messages. I don't know if they also send them a message saying,
well, that's a good question.
You know, yeah. I don't know. It'd be nice to know. And actually, I think it's true also in things like, you know, it's really interesting you say that there are just some markets where, like gambling, like social media, where it is the kind of the problems are so like behavioural, like, you know, that you've got to do something different. You know, and there are like the gambling commission and stuff like that, where they do take this kind of very they have to like profile their users much more heavily, and they have to like look at like kind of what are your patterns in use, like how much money do you have, what kind of income do you have, to know a lot more about their users. And then in theory they're meant to kind of step in and say, hold on a second, you've done like this many bets in the last 3 hours, or, you know, trying to adapt their service to people they can see are kind of vulnerable in the sort of gambling sense, although whether that's very effective or not is another question. So I think there are sort of some glimmers of hope. I think actually, so, you know, working in Ofcom, and we're looking at this sort of online safety sort of challenge, right? And how do we get the social media firms to, social media, pornography, dating, all of those guys to kind of think about how to protect their users better.
Yeah.
Quite a long way, I would say, from accepting that social media use is like a really deep behavioural problem. That, like, you know, that it's not a sort of question of sort of tinkering around the edges a bit. There's like some really profound problems with the way humans are making decisions or not making decisions, right? Like how they're sort of drawn into behaviours that kind of are basically quite a long way from sort of most models of autonomy. And that's partly a political thing, isn't it? There's big libertarian sort of arguments that like free speech, and you've got to just let people do what they want to do, and people obviously can just jump off platforms and go to other ones, etc. But I think it sort of goes back to that evidence point. I think it's really hard. Like, we sort of all know that there's like a massive behavioural problems here, and people are like, sort of, you know, kind of losing that battle of like, you know, how much do the platforms know about you and your behaviour? Probably more than you do. What tools do they have to like get you, target you, like hook you in? They've got the, you know, they're learning about those tools all the time and refining those. Like, you know, it just feels a bit like they're just the kind of the everyday consumers sort of a bit on the losing side of this sort of arms race, so to speak. But I think it's hard for us to have that evidence to say this is a really clear behavioural problem, and therefore we need to treat this differently. It doesn't. It's funny how it has kind of happened a little bit in gambling, but still got massive problems with gambling, haven't we? But I don't think we've got there, and I think it's quite hard. So, like, it's interesting you're talking about like, how can you try and demonstrate these harms? How can you sort of try and demonstrate the kind of how human imperfections are really being exploited in a really harmful way? It's actually quite difficult, and I don't think the evidence base is there to really make that like in a compelling way that politicians and others can say, look, it's it's not even up for debate. It's obvious, but we're not there, and I'm not that clear about how we're going to get there either. I think that's the real one of the big challenges.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think, yeah, really insightful comments. And I agree, there's lots of rays of hope. There's lots of really great work happening across regulators and policymakers around the world, and academics as well. I think what sort of unites those markets is, I'm hesitating because I wonder if this is the right language, but it's almost that the business model is one of behavioural predators, particularly on things like online gambling. And, you know, in terms of building the evidence base, so I think, as many of you know, we have a large program on gambling that we've been running for about 18 months. And one of the early pieces of work we did was an audit of the online choice architecture of those online gambling providers. And there's some really egregious practices, and they are truly predatory and exploitative. And, you know, things like it takes 3 to 4 times longer to close an account than it does to open one. It's extremely difficult to withdraw money, and you end up going through many, many loops to take money off the site once you've put it on, though it's very easy to put it on. One of the early experiments we did on a previous piece of work was looking at how responsible gambling tools, which are regulatory requirements, are actually rolled out in practice. And many of them are rolled out in the black letter of the law, but very much not the spirit of it. And, you know, to give a concrete example, one of those responsible gambling tools was that online gambling providers needed to give customers, particularly those who were identified at risk of problem gambling or who were already identified as problem gamblers, the opportunity to set daily deposit limits on the site. And those tools were in place, but most of them had a drop-down menu that had a range from £100 to £100,000. This is a daily deposit limit. You know, that's like more than 3 times the average annual income in the UK for a daily deposit limit. It's absolutely crazy. And, you know, we, again, coming back to the importance of looking at the whole system and second round effects, we ran a really nice experiment looking at the impact of removing that anchor and having a much lower anchor, and also taking away the drop down altogether and just having a free text box. Both of those reduced the daily deposit limit by about half, but they didn't have any impact on how much people were actually gambling on the site. So these are, you know, they are complex systems, and, you know, as you said, Rupert, the providers are experimenting on every single aspect of that site and optimizing it to have people gamble more and gamble longer. And I do think for those types of markets, like, it does need a muscular regulatory response that is in line with that, and kind of evens the playing field, if you like. And I don't think the way we're conceptualizing those markets really allows for that at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, just, sorry, no, I was waiting just to come back. I do think, you know, things like the consumer duty that the FCA have brought in,
Yes.
so that just to explain, for those who don't know, they've actually, I don't know in great deal of depth, but essentially they've sort of tried to reverse the balance of responsibilities so that financial companies have to demonstrate that they've really thought about the kind of user experience. And it's things that, you know, it's things like subscription traps, and like, it's very easy to sign up. It's really easy, it's really difficult to get out of a product, for example. And they're sort of trying to put this duty on the businesses to demonstrate actually that they aren't kind of taking advantage of cognitive biases to kind of basically take advantage of inertia or add in frictions. They've got to prove that themselves. That's like a duty imposed on the financial firm. So quite a big deal, like in shifting that balance of responsibility from, the regulator or someone else has to demonstrate that what they're doing is causing problems and humans aren't very good at navigating it, to them having to demonstrate that they've thought about it. They've taken those things into consideration. They paid as much attention. I think that's the ideal, isn't it? They want businesses to pay as much attention to like hooking their customers in, and also they do pay a lot of attention to sales, obviously bringing people in, but could they pay the same attention to helping people out when things go wrong or they want to get out, and they're trying to sort of rebalance that. It's very early days actually, but that is that's probably in the kind of the robust measure kind of, like getting to that situation where you've almost reversed the burden of proof, so that the platforms have to demonstrate that actually people aren't falling foul of their stuff, they're able to manage their time and emotions and whatever else, like effectively, that you're not distorting that too heavily. That would be great. But as you said, I like the kind of building up this evidence to get there, but it feels like quite a long way to go.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, and it will be interesting. No, go ahead, Aaron.
I think it's a discussion that will continue as well in this as we proceed with various initiatives. Kristen.
Yes, here with a question. So my question is a little bit more exploratory, and I kind of added on a bit per the previous commenters. I wonder if you could speak more about sort of the interventions and approaches you're talking about with social normative approaches. For example, you mentioned, I think, the green license plates. So are you looking kind of to change norms by increasing visibility or increase visibility for norms to kind of get a higher buy-on? And I wonder if you have an example around sustainability. And I know this is kind of the previous comment about, why people don't do that. And I think that's obviously an issue where we struggle a lot with kind of behavioral change. And with that, have you faced challenges where a lot of, behavioral interventions may be very individual focused, like we talk about, for example, going vegan, that there's the individual, but there's more of this kind of system issue, or, do people feel like, even if vegan is a social norm, am I really going to make an impact to something as big as climate change when there's these oil companies? I guess that kind of tension between individual focus and these wider system problems with a problem such large as sustainability, if you've encountered difficulties with that, with the socially normative approaches, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So I guess some of the early studies from the Behavioural Insights team were leveraging social norms. So particularly on things like tax collection, telling people that 9 out of 10 people paid their taxes on time, significantly increased the rate at which HMRC was collecting that tax. The reason that worked, in my view, is that firstly, that social norm is very high. And so the people who are not doing that are the outliers. But also it's surprisingly high for people. So it corrected a misperception that actually they didn't think they were the outliers and then realized that they were. The challenge with a lot of sustainability behaviors is that the social norm is low. And so telling people that 0.5 out of 10 is a vegan is not very compelling, because it's not kind of tapping into either of those mechanisms that make social norm interventions effective. So some research that was done, actually I think by a PhD student at the University of California a few years ago, or maybe he was at Stanford, he was exploring the idea of dynamic social norms, which is that particularly in sustainability where the overall norm is low, but it's changing quickly, actually it's helpful to tell people that that norm is changing rapidly. So, every year, the number of vegans in the world is doubling or tripling or whatever it might be. And that was also the idea behind the green number plates, which is that the proportion of electric vehicles in the UK at the time when it was introduced was low, but it was increasing rapidly. And that actually the number plates were a very visible way for people to see that changing social norm, and to keep track of it, and to have that sense of actually, you know, you have that availability bias, you're suddenly seeing them everywhere. And it's also a very visible way for people to signal that, you know, that pro-environmental behaviour on their own part. So I think there is, you know, more mileage in that across a range of different sustainability behaviours, particularly those dynamic norms. But I would encourage you to think about it beyond traditional comms interventions and think more about like those physical interventions and what they could look like.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Right.
But there is the point, I think, though, that Kristen raised that might be worthy of a response from you, Liz, about, you know, the individual versus the, you know, structural, I suppose, isn't it? Since it's such a big issue being discussed at the moment.
Yes,
You know,
sorry, I forgot that bit. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why, you know, I talked about some of that upstream downstream model, but the team led by Toby Park, who's our head of energy and sustainability, recently published a report on a net zero society, and they've really kind of categorized the different interventions into downstream ones, which are focused on individual behaviors, midstream, which are focused on that enabling environment, and then upstream, which are focused on businesses, organizations, systems. And really our hypothesis is that all of the vast majority of the policy energy and everybody's energy should be focused on those upstream interventions. And those are the ones that are going to make the difference in actually getting us there, rather than exhorting individuals to, you know, turn their lights off and everything else. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Malte.
Hey, thanks, Liz, for the input. I have also a question about, you know, this first point on the enabling choice environment. And I don't know whether it's upstream or midstream. My question, I guess it's more maybe addressing midstream phenomena. So when we talk about behavioral market failures, obviously there's, you know, vast literature, many origins, and many causes why there might be behavioral market failures. But one is actually what one could classify as, you know, social effects on the individual, such as conformity cascades or peer pressure, that actually work against a good decision on the individual level. Now, when you talked about enabling social environments, and it was just one example, you had the green number plate example, and you used that term, making environments socially normative. And I think, of course, I mean, if we have externality issues such as climate change and others, it might make sense to make an environment socially normative because the social matters in these individual decisions. But what about all these behavioral market failures where the social works against a good decision? It's almost like breaking up this social normative environment. And now let me give you maybe two examples,
like
right?
Online abuse or something like that.
Exactly. I mean, that would be one, but all sorts of, like, you know, when economists look at markets, of course, you have herd behavior, you have what I would call conformity cascades, peer pressure that really creates instability on a market level, right? And the idea then would be really to break this up. Now, it's an explorative point here. I just wonder whether you see work on this. And, you know, not just when we talk about externality issues, these things are important, but also when we think about life choices, right? In a lot of cases, you know, when we construct our beliefs and preferences, when we grow up, we make bad choices because we look around us and we look what other people do, and by and large, they make also bad choices. So we're in these cascades, right? Is there work on that, or is it an issue that you're concerned with? Yeah, would love to hear your thoughts.
Super interesting. Just taking a moment, because I haven't actually thought about it in that conceptual framing before, and I think it's a really nice framing. So in terms of, I think you're absolutely right. There are issues and challenges where that normative environment works against what you're trying to achieve. And I guess bullying, online abuse, there are lots of examples where that's the case. I'm thinking through some of the things we have done. I'm not sure they perfectly map onto the ambition of what you're talking about, but for example, we ran a series of experiments in Australia looking at how to encourage upstander behaviour in bullying in particular, but also sexual harassment in universities, and to kind of turn around this idea that, you know, you don't just need to be a bystander to that kind of behaviour, but you can break that kind of that environment where it's just not commented on and it's sort of tacitly accepted, by encouraging people to stand up in those moments and say that it's not acceptable and it's not okay, but to do that in a way that feels safe and feels like, you know, they don't end up being sort of victimized as part of that. Yeah, but I mean, it's definitely food for thought. It's a really interesting idea, because I think when you're looking at things like civility and abuse on online platforms as well, to keep that theme running through this discussion, those types of comments are so disproportionately visible on platforms, and they do create that sense that actually that is acceptable, or at least normal, if not acceptable. And interventions that could help break that could really be very effective. I'm not sure I've answered that well, Malte, but you've given me a lot of things to think about.
Thank you. No, that's great. And I'm just thinking also when we, you know, obviously when we think about belief formation around climate change issues, I mean, obviously there's a lot of the similar, let's say, behavioral problems, and people holding absurd beliefs, etc., where the social environment is normative, but that's exactly the problem. Yeah, exactly. But thank you. I mean, it's a very explorative, open-ended point, but thanks for sharing your thoughts.
No, it's really interesting. Thank you.
I'd like to encourage Malte to do some work on this, actually, because I think he's raising a very important issue that's underexplored at the moment. But you know what I think about that already, Malte, so I didn't say it.
I would love to see it too, for what it's worth.
Well, maybe there's scope for some kind of collaboration there. Right? Yeah,
definitely.
Graham had his hand up for a long time, and he took it down again. But I'd like to hear Graham's question if he's still there. Are you around, Graham?
Yeah, I'm still here, but I took it down because you know, my question would have taken us off in a different and I think rather deep direction, which we haven't got time for. No, please, Graham, I'll try and put my thoughts together, Adam, and offer to lead a discussion at some time in the future, but I don't think with 5 minutes to go is a good time to get into it, and there's other people with their hands up, so thank you for noticing, but I'll keep my hand down and my mouth shut.
Okay, all right, I can't persuade him, Liz.
No worries.
You know what he's like. Once he's got something in his mind, we can't persuade him otherwise. Yeah, and let's bring you back in then.
I appreciate the space to have the second question in. I was just wondering what your perception is, or why are we not able to regulate with more kind of what you call behavioral standards, so to speak? You said there are websites that can do, you know, putting money in takes a second, putting money out takes 30 minutes. Why is there not a rule? If you run such a website, it has to be for an unexperienced user the same time. They run whatever they do. We do an experiment, we find out it's not true, and then they get a fine. Or I did work on cookie banners, right? And you could have a standard that is non-normative and asks, if your design deviates from this, and we can show this in a simple experiment, you get a fine. Because otherwise we're always looking at each of those individual ones, and they get much creative and they have the opportunity to test, and then you run always after. But if you kind of set boundaries, there might be a way to put risk to that type of innovation.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think that would be an excellent place to get to, but I think the barriers are mostly, I guess, pragmatic and evidential at the moment, in that where would you set the threshold? So I think it's a great idea to have some kind of audit process where, as part of supervision and inspection of firms, depending on the regulatory powers, you would do something like a sludge audit or a behavioural audit of the online choice architecture of a website or a platform or an app, and say, yes, like it should be, let's say for argument's sake, that doing something positive on the website, like opening an account, putting money in, that if you want to do the opposite, it shouldn't take you more than 100% of that time. I think the challenge at the moment is where to set those thresholds and how to actually conduct that kind of audit activity. And so I think that the work that's being done, particularly across the UK regulators like the CMA, is starting to build the base for a future like that. But I do think it's a while off. But in my opinion, that is where we need to get to, and to do it in a way that's somewhat automated as well in that supervision and inspection.
Okay. Does anybody? I've got a question myself, but it's more important to hear from other people. So I'll play a bit of a devil's advocate, Liz, if that's all right.
Yes, go for it, Adam.
I think most people that know me, that know that I believe in behavioural regulation, and I think that industries such as the online gambling industry are very sort of a very bad advert for a free society, really, aren't they?
Mm.
But there is a whole range of sort of industries or commercial interests, let's say, where you could legitimately at least consider behavioural regulation, where sometimes I think that this sort of goes in line with some things that Bob Sugden says, actually, where the interests of that commercial party might be a little bit underplayed when we're thinking about regulating them. So, if you do think about, I don't know, reordering foods around, trying to get people to take vegan options, don't we have to consider the interest of the canteen owner who is there to make profits, really, in a free society, isn't it?
Yeah.
So do we underplay that sometimes, if we're thinking about trying to protect a free society, which I think most of us, to a greater or lesser extent, most of us involved in behavioural public policy believe, I think, in a free society, don't we? So that's my question, really. Are we sort of underplaying those interests, the harms that we may impose upon those commercial interests to some extent for this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And actually coming back to those experiments I mentioned at the start on the food delivery platforms, that was done in a simulated environment, and we tested a range of different interventions that reduce the total calories in the baskets. So things like defaulting people into the smallest portion size, changing the name of the smallest portion size, changing the choice architecture of it. In all of those interventions, though, the basket also cost less. And I think it's a super interesting question. Is that a good thing? And I think from an individual consumer perspective, yes, it is, in that we're in a cost of living crisis, and we are, I guess, maximizing their utility by giving them more free resources to put elsewhere, more available resources rather. But even from a policy perspective, as well as your angle, Adam, around the interests of the platform and the restaurants, it is a tricky circle to square about actually how would you get a regulation like that off the ground in a way that isn't harmful to those restaurants and the commercial interests of the platform. And I don't know the answer, but I do wonder if we need a kind of better common methodology for cost benefit analysis of some of these types of interventions, and to be, having a serious conversation about the costs as well as the benefits.
I'm not saying that, that we should necessarily not regulate them. I'm just saying, it just strikes me that sometimes perhaps we're sort of underplaying those interests as well, you know what I mean, when we think about these things.
I think actually in some of these markets, like something that's really underutilized in my view is self-exclusion tools, particularly in things like gambling. It's like that seems a way that you can balance those interests if you have people explicitly self-excluding and choosing to do so.
So we've got 4 minutes left. We've got Kristen and Rennie both got their hands up. Could we just take both of your points together, and then Liz can finally respond if she needs to any of those, and then we'll finish for today. Kristen, you first, and then.
Yeah, mine was just really a comment kind of on Adam's point, is that I think, especially with sustainability and food choice, is that we don't necessarily consider people's say things like farmers or local farmers or people who have a tradition. There's people that there are social considerations and their right to, continue a family tradition, or there's other parties I think that need to be taken into account with this, and people are aware of that from their experiences. So I thought it was a good point that I think sometimes is missing. And I'll turn it over to Renee. You don't have to respond to that.
Renee.
Yeah, just to Adam's point, surely if regulation is applied to everyone in the same manner across the board, you provide a level playing field, and then that evens out. So people, the provider will still compete with other people. It's just the rules have changed. And it's no different than regulation in any other market. That's
okay.
all.
Well, I don't think either of those questions. I think they were both comments, weren't they?
Yeah, they were.
Things,
yes.
They're things I need to think about as well. Well, thank you very much, Liz. That was great. I mean, it's a topic that I really like myself, as I think and I hope you got something out of it as well. I think there were some great questions, so thank you to everybody who contributed.
Yeah, I really did. No, thank you. Thanks for the great.
Just before we finish, we have got a full program already for next academic year in the HIAC series, and we'll continue. But we are going to bring. I know this won't please all of you, but we are going to bring the seminars forward again slightly to 1 to 2 p.m. on Thursdays, one Thursday a month, and it's just because I think that in this later point of the day, it sort of clashes more with the other things that people have to do. So we're just going to have to bring it over on a lunch slot. I think that's going to affect Multi more than anybody else, but he usually attends these things anyway, so no matter what the day they are. On the subject of Multi is going to be leading, I think, the next seminar, right, Multi, and the May seminar. I think it's you to lead the May seminar in the HIAC program. You don't remember yourself, but I think it is you.
I think he's June, but no, I could be wrong.
Okay, is it Multi and June? Okay, then it's in the May seminar is going to be led. It's a change in the program because Lucia Reich was meant to do it, but she gave the LSE Behavioural Public Policy lecture this year. So Lucia is going to give one of the seminars next academic year. The May seminar then is going to be led by Sanchayan Banerjee and Peter John. They're going to do a double act in the May seminar.
Which will be 2 sessions on agency, theirs and mine. So
yeah, they'll probably be linked. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much again, all of you. Thank you again, Liz, and I'll see you all soon.